Hello and welcome to our video overview of the presentation slides for our observations, pineapple charts, and observe me sections. I'm happy to have a chance to review some of the outstanding observation resources and to be able to look at the multiple uses of the UDL rubric. And that will be covered in video 1 and in video 2. We're going to tackle the pineapple chart and observe me options, which will prove to be fun ways to be able to learn within the walls of your colleagues' classrooms. So the first set of resources I wanted to share with you were the observation resources. So we did have access to some of these documents in the module overview that was connected with our observation project. Now, due to the pandemic, some of you may not have had an opportunity to complete the observation, so we switched gears and created a virtual learning tools assignment. But for some of you that did have a chance to review some of these resources already, I highly encourage you to review all of them in this document as well. These are about 7 or 8 different options that I think you'll find quite helpful in being able to identify areas of the networks that you as a school, you as an individual teacher, your colleagues, and where you might be falling in terms of the rubric and daily checklists and different ways to be able to identify what practices should look like in the classrooms. So there, like I mentioned, please review all of these and you'll find maybe 1 or 2 tools that you might want to start implementing and using either on your own or perhaps introducing to your learning community to see what might be a good fit. So one of the resources that we're going to take a few minutes to review is the UDL Progression and Teacher Implementation Rubric. You'll see here that there is an article that you can link to that gives you an overview, but I want to encourage the use of this in terms of a self-assessment tool and a collaborative planning tool and as a feedback and or observation tool. So when I think about the benefits of using this UDL progression rubric, it really is to see, where you are and where you're headed, where your goals are, where you want to be. It's to be able to explore where the practice falls currently. And, in terms of using it for self-assessment, it's to be able to see how you want to best move forward individually. For a reference tool in terms of seeing where potentially you are as a district in general, or perhaps, where an individual teacher might be if you're using it for a certain type of learning walk or informal observations and things such as that. When you think of this also as a collaborative planning tool, this is where educators can really dig down into, where they think, they are as a grade level, as a school, and to be able to figure out what changes you want to make to the practice and what changes you want to make in terms of planning your lessons and to really push each other with mastery-oriented feedback. Evolving into an observation tool, it really is to be able to include that in some of potentially the educator evaluation process. So you'll see that one of the links to the resources is indeed a link to that specific evaluation process. When we think of this as a self-assessment tool, this is probably a great place to start. And often I will have groups that I'm working with, take their individual pulse to see where they fall in terms of the rubric and in each individual network, because you certainly could be in a different place depending on if it's action and expression or if it's representation or if it's engagement and where you are with that. It helps us to ground our practice in these distinct phases of implementation and helps to personalize our process. And I love this bottom quote. It says, it allows us to acknowledge changes in our practice. Basically, coming up with statements of, I used to do this, but now I do, and whatever it happens to be that you're looking for in terms of setting your goals individually. So when you use this as a self-assessment tool, there are two questions that I definitely want you to consider. So I encourage you to take this and try this out. So as you look at the rubric, one question will be, what are your next steps in terms of implementation individually? And then based on your current level of practice, what is one goal that you have moving forward? So these are some great things to reflect upon as you go through and consider the different resources that you have, and being able to define what you can do individually, what your team can use collaboratively, and what you might actually use as feedback or an observation tool. This next link leads you to a more granular view of the UDL progression rubric. This is the 8-page lengthy document which identifies all of the guidelines within each of the networks to really show you where you might be, where your district might be in terms of UDL implementation. So that is something that you may want to use. It's one of the links that is on our list of resources. And lastly, I wanted to throw in something that is the polar opposite of looking at the granular progression rubric we just looked at. This is a UDL flow chart. It's an if yes or no and moving to the next step. So this is something that we will revisit when we talk about lesson design and planning for lessons in terms of sort of a checklist and a flow chart. But I thought it might be helpful just to see your steps in terms of a lesson by lesson and where you think you might be. So that's another resource that can be very helpful when you're giving feedback to a colleague, being able to do walkthroughs, and being able to use it as a collaborative tool together as a team. So in this concluding part of our overview, the question is, how will you use the UDL implementation rubric? So we talked about 3 different approaches to it. How do you envision using the rubric, and what can you do to be able to move along to the next step in your implementation? These are great tools to be able to share with your learning community as you go through the stages of implementation, and certainly something for you to reflect upon personally with your own practice.